I wish I had never looked at that phone, Margaret Collins would later think, because 20 minutes earlier she had been sitting at her dining table believing she was surrounded by love. The house in Columbus, Ohio had been full that evening, warm with the smell of roasted chicken, buttered corn, and fresh rolls Margaret had picked up from the bakery 3 blocks away, the same place she had visited every Sunday for nearly 20 years. At 68 years old, Margaret still liked hosting family dinners the old-fashioned way, with real plates, cloth napkins, and the long oak table her late husband Robert had built in the garage more than 3 decades ago. Her son Daniel sat across from her, tall and broad-shouldered just like his father had been, while his wife Ashley leaned close beside him, smiling politely at everything Margaret said. The 3 of them had gathered for what Daniel had called a small celebration. Nothing fancy, just dinner together because, as Ashley had explained earlier that afternoon, we should appreciate family while we still have it. Margaret had liked hearing that. It had sounded thoughtful, sincere, the kind of thing a loving daughter-in-law might say. As the evening moved along, the conversation stayed light. Daniel talked about work. Ashley mentioned a friend who had just moved to Arizona, and Margaret listened, occasionally laughing, occasionally remembering how quiet this house had been after Robert passed away 5 years earlier. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt alive again. When the plates were cleared and the glasses were refilled with sparkling cider, Ashley suddenly stood up from her chair, lifting her glass with a bright, practiced smile. "I just want to say something," she announced warmly, glancing between Daniel and Margaret. "To Margaret, the strongest woman I know." Daniel nodded, raising his own glass as if he had rehearsed this moment. "Mom's always been the heart of this family," he added. Margaret felt her chest tighten with emotion as the glasses clinked together softly above the table. For a brief moment, the room seemed full of gratitude and affection, the kind of simple happiness she had hoped her family would share for many years to come. She smiled, blinking back a little moisture from her eyes, thinking how proud Robert would have been to see Daniel grown into a thoughtful husband and son. The laughter continued for several minutes after the toast, and Margaret excused herself to carry a few dishes into the kitchen. The house grew quieter once she stepped away from the dining room, the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the wall clock filling the space instead of conversation. She placed the plates in the sink and reached for a towel when she noticed a phone resting on the kitchen counter, its screen lighting up suddenly in the dim room. The notification banner appeared clearly against the glowing display. It was Ashley's phone. Margaret didn't mean to read it. In fact, she had already started turning away when a single sentence caught her eye and stopped her completely. The message preview read, "Did Daniel talk to his mom about the house yet?" Margaret stood there, motionless, the towel still in her hands as the warm sound of laughter drifted faintly from the dining room down the hallway. Just 20 feet away, her family was still celebrating her health. But in the quiet kitchen, staring at that small glowing screen, Margaret Collins felt the first shadow of doubt settle slowly into her heart. Margaret remained in the kitchen for several seconds, staring at the glowing screen of Ashley's phone as if it had suddenly become something fragile and dangerous at the same time. The message notification slowly faded, leaving the dark glass surface reflecting the soft kitchen light and the faint outline of Margaret's face. She felt a strange sensation in her chest, not exactly fear, not exactly anger, but something quieter and colder. For a long moment she told herself it was nothing. Perhaps Ashley's friend was simply asking an innocent question. Perhaps Daniel had mentioned helping his mother with something practical, like paperwork or maintenance on the house. Margaret had lived long enough to know that assumptions could hurt relationships, and she had always tried to be fair. Still, the words stayed in her mind. Did Daniel talk to his mom about the house yet? Margaret slowly placed the towel on the counter and looked toward the hallway where the dining room lights glowed warmly. She could hear Daniel laughing at something Ashley had just said. The sound felt familiar and comforting, the same laugh he had carried since childhood, but tonight it reached her ears differently. Margaret Collins had raised Daniel alone for many years after Robert spent long hours working construction projects across Ohio. She had driven Daniel to school every morning in an old blue sedan that struggled through Ohio winters, packed his lunches, helped him study for exams, and sat in cold bleachers during football games when he was in high school. She had never considered those things sacrifices. To her, that was simply what a mother did. When Daniel married Ashley 4 years earlier, Margaret had genuinely tried to welcome her into the family. Ashley had seemed charming when they first met. She had complimented Margaret's cooking, asked about family traditions, and even brought flowers the first time she visited the house. Margaret remembered thinking that Daniel had chosen someone thoughtful. Over time, however, there had been moments that felt slightly uncomfortable, although Margaret had always dismissed them. Ashley sometimes asked questions about the house that seemed unusually detailed, such as how long Margaret planned to live there or whether the mortgage had already been paid off. Daniel had occasionally mentioned that managing a large house alone might become difficult someday. At the time, Margaret had interpreted those conversations as concern. After all, she was 68 years old. It made sense that her son might worry about her living alone in a two-story home that was more than 30 years old. Yet standing in the quiet kitchen now, Margaret felt those memories shifting slightly, like puzzle pieces that had been turned the wrong direction before. The sound of chairs moving in the dining room reminded her that she had been gone longer than expected. She gently slid Ashley's phone back to the exact place where it had been resting on the counter, careful not to leave any sign that she had noticed the message. Then she took a slow breath and walked toward the hallway. When she returned to the dining room, Daniel looked up with an easy smile. Ashley was pouring another round of sparkling cider into the glasses. Everything looked perfectly normal. Margaret sat down in her chair and smiled back at them both. But for the first time that evening, the warmth in the room felt slightly different, as if something important had shifted in a way no one else had noticed yet. Margaret kept her expression calm as the conversation around the table continued, but inside her mind something had quietly begun to change. Daniel was explaining a project at work, describing how his company had recently expanded their office space by nearly 2,000 square feet, and Ashley listened with interest while occasionally nodding and adding a comment. Margaret watched them carefully now, not with suspicion exactly, but with a new kind of attention she had never felt before. For years, she had trusted the rhythm of these family dinners. They had always followed the same comfortable pattern, a little conversation, a little laughter, and the reassuring sense that the people around the table cared about one another. Tonight that rhythm felt slightly off, like a familiar song being played one note too slow. Ashley reached for her glass again and smiled at Margaret. "Dinner was wonderful, Margaret. You always make everything taste better than any restaurant." The compliment sounded sincere, yet Margaret noticed something she had never truly paid attention to before. Ashley often gave compliments in public moments, especially when Daniel was present, but when the two of them had been alone together in the past, their conversations had sometimes felt strangely brief. Margaret suddenly remembered a small moment from the previous autumn. Ashley had visited the house on a Saturday afternoon while Daniel was running errands. Margaret had offered coffee, and the two of them had sat at the same kitchen table where the phone message had appeared tonight. During that conversation, Ashley had asked a question that seemed harmless at the time. She had glanced around the room and said, "This place must be worth quite a bit now. Houses in this neighborhood are selling for almost $400,000. Margaret had laughed lightly back then and said she had never really thought about the value of the house because it had always been home rather than an investment. Ashley had smiled and nodded, but she had followed up with another question about property taxes and whether the house was completely paid off. At the time, Margaret had assumed Ashley was simply curious about real estate, the way many younger couples were when they started thinking about buying their own home. Now, sitting at the dining table again, Margaret realized there had been several conversations like that. Daniel had once mentioned that managing a house with 2 floors might eventually become tiring for her. Another time, Ashley had suggested that moving to a smaller place someday could make life easier. None of those comments had sounded alarming when she first heard them. In fact, Margaret had interpreted them as concern from a son who wanted his mother to be comfortable in the future. Yet the message she had seen in the kitchen continued echoing quietly in her thoughts. Did Daniel talk to his mom about the house yet? The words seemed simple, almost casual, but they carried a meaning that Margaret could no longer ignore. She picked up her glass and took a small sip of sparkling cider while listening to Daniel describe weekend traffic near Interstate 71. Ashley laughed at something he said and lightly touched his arm. Everything about the scene looked ordinary, warm, and peaceful. Anyone watching from the outside would have seen nothing but a close family enjoying dinner together. But Margaret Collins understood something new now. For the first time that evening, she was not simply listening to the conversation. She was watching carefully, measuring each word, each glance, each quiet pause between them. And the more she observed, the more a quiet question continued forming in her mind about what her family might be planning to ask her next. Margaret continued listening to the conversation as the evening moved forward, but the message she had seen earlier refused to leave her thoughts. Daniel was now talking about weekend plans, explaining that he and Ashley might drive about 40 miles outside the city to visit a farmer's market that several friends had recommended. Ashley nodded enthusiastically and added that she loved the idea of finding fresh vegetables and homemade jam from local vendors. Margaret smiled politely and commented that it sounded like a pleasant trip, but her attention remained divided. Part of her was still replaying the quiet moment in the kitchen when the phone screen had lit up. The words had been simple, almost casual, yet they now carried a weight that seemed to grow heavier the longer she thought about them. Did Daniel talk to his mom about the house yet? Margaret had spent decades learning how to read the small signals people often overlooked. Years of raising a child, managing a household, and working part-time at the local library had taught her that people sometimes revealed their intentions in ways they did not even realize. She looked across the table again, studying Daniel and Ashley with a calm expression. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stretched slightly, looking relaxed and comfortable in the home where he had grown up. Ashley sat beside him, occasionally brushing a strand of hair behind her ear while listening. They appeared perfectly normal, perfectly at ease. If Margaret had not seen that message, she might have believed nothing had changed. Yet now every small detail seemed more noticeable. Ashley's eyes moved briefly toward Daniel before she spoke, almost as if she were checking whether he wanted to say something first. Daniel cleared his throat once or twice during the conversation, something Margaret remembered he often did when he was preparing to bring up a topic he felt unsure about. The more Margaret observed, the more a quiet realization began to form. Perhaps the message she saw had not been random curiosity from Ashley's friend. Perhaps it was a reminder about a conversation that Daniel and Ashley had already been planning to have. Margaret felt no sudden anger as the thought crossed her mind. Instead, she felt something steadier and more thoughtful. She had lived long enough to know that people sometimes made plans they believed were practical, even if those plans were uncomfortable to discuss. She placed her hands gently on the table and asked Daniel a simple question about work, allowing the conversation to continue naturally. Daniel answered easily, describing how his office had recently reorganized several departments and how traffic during his commute could add nearly 15 extra minutes to his drive each morning. Ashley laughed softly and said that Daniel always complained about the highway, even when the delay was only a few miles of slow traffic. Their voices blended together in the familiar rhythm of casual conversation. Yet Margaret noticed something else now. Neither of them had asked her about her own plans or how she had been feeling lately. For most of the evening, the focus had remained on their lives, their schedules, their future ideas. Margaret quietly folded her napkin on the table and looked around the dining room. The photographs on the walls showed decades of family history, birthdays, holidays, and smiling faces that once filled the house with noise and excitement. Robert had hung those pictures himself many years earlier, carefully measuring the distance between each frame with a small tape measure from his toolbox. Margaret remembered how proud he had been of this home. She turned her attention back to Daniel and Ashley as they continued talking, and a calm thought settled into her mind. If there truly was a conversation they were preparing to have about the house, then sooner or later it would arrive. And when that moment came, Margaret Collins intended to be ready to listen very carefully to every word they chose. Margaret let the conversation continue naturally for several more minutes, nodding occasionally while Daniel and Ashley talked about their weekend plans, but the quiet awareness in her mind did not fade. It sat there patiently, like a small stone at the bottom of a clear glass of water, impossible to ignore once she knew it was there. Daniel eventually pushed his chair back slightly and stood to stretch his legs, explaining that he wanted to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. Ashley followed him a moment later, saying she would help clear the rest of the dishes. Margaret remained seated at the table for a few seconds after they left the room, listening to their footsteps moving across the hardwood floor toward the kitchen. The dining room suddenly felt larger and quieter without them. She looked down at the table Robert had built so many years ago and gently ran her hand across the smooth wood surface. For decades, that table had been the center of birthdays, holiday dinners, and long conversations that stretched late into the night. Margaret had always believed those memories formed the strongest foundation a family could have. From the kitchen, she could hear the soft sound of running water and the clinking of plates. Daniel's voice drifted down the hallway, calm and relaxed, followed by Ashley answering something she could not quite hear clearly. Margaret stood slowly and carried the remaining glasses toward the kitchen, moving carefully but without hesitation. When she stepped into the room, Daniel was drying his hands with a paper towel while Ashley stood near the counter organizing the dishes Margaret had brought earlier. For a moment, everything looked completely ordinary again. Ashley glanced up and smiled politely. "You really did not have to cook all of this tonight," she said warmly. "It must have taken you hours." Margaret returned the smile and told her that cooking had always been one of the few things that made a quiet house feel full again. Daniel nodded and reached for the refrigerator, pulling out a bottle of water before leaning casually against the counter. As he twisted the cap open, Ashley's phone vibrated lightly where it rested beside the sink. The sound was small, barely noticeable, but Margaret felt her attention move toward it immediately. The screen lit up once again. Ashley turned quickly, almost automatically, but she was a step too far away to reach it before the notification appeared. Margaret did not move closer. She did not pick up the phone this time. She simply saw the message preview from where she stood across the counter. It was from the same contact as before. Megan. The new message appeared directly beneath the earlier one that Margaret had already read. This time the words were even clearer. "You should talk to her soon. If she signs the papers, everything will be easier later." For a brief second, Margaret felt the room grow very still around her. Daniel continued drinking his water, unaware of the screen glowing beside him. Ashley stepped forward quickly and picked up the phone, glancing down before locking the screen with a smooth motion. She slipped it into her pocket and turned back toward the sink as if nothing unusual had happened. Margaret kept her expression calm, the same gentle expression she had worn all evening. But inside her thoughts a quiet certainty had now begun to take shape. The message in the kitchen earlier had not been a misunderstanding. And whatever conversation Daniel and Ashley were planning about the house, it was no longer a distant possibility. It was something that was already moving forward, step by step. Even while they stood together in the warm light of the same kitchen Margaret had called home for more than 30 years. Margaret did not react immediately after seeing the second message on Ashley's phone. Years of life had taught her that the most powerful response was often patience. She continued rinsing a plate under the warm stream of water at the sink, listening to Daniel talking casually about a coworker who had recently moved to another department. Ashley responded with small comments, her voice light and ordinary, as if nothing unusual had happened. If someone had walked into the kitchen at that moment, they would have seen 3 people standing comfortably together after dinner. Nothing about the scene suggested tension. Yet Margaret Collins was no longer hearing the conversation the same way she had earlier that evening. The 2 messages she had seen now sat quietly in her mind, and with them came a new way of looking at everything around her. When Daniel finished his water, he placed the bottle in the recycling bin and glanced toward Margaret with a familiar smile. "Mom, you should really let us help you with the dishes next time," he said. "You do too much." Margaret dried her hands with a towel and nodded politely. "I have been doing this for a long time," she answered calmly. "It is a habit now." Ashley laughed lightly at that and began stacking the clean plates. "Daniel is right, though," she added. "You do not have to take care of everything alone anymore." The sentence sounded kind, almost thoughtful, but Margaret noticed the way Ashley spoke the final words, as if they carried an extra meaning just beneath the surface. Margaret placed another plate in the rack and looked briefly toward the window above the sink. Outside, the quiet street was lit by a single street lamp near the corner, the same one Robert had asked the city to install years ago after several neighbors complained about the darkness along the sidewalk. For decades, Margaret had felt safe in this neighborhood. It was the place where Daniel learned to ride a bicycle, where children once played basketball in the driveway, and where neighbors waved to each other while walking their dogs in the evening. That sense of familiarity had always given Margaret comfort. Tonight it gave her something else as well. Perspective. She realized suddenly that she had spent most of the evening reacting to the messages she saw without fully thinking about what they meant. But now, Standing in her own kitchen while Daniel and Ashley talked quietly beside her, a clearer understanding began forming. The messages had not mentioned the house by accident. Someone outside the family was expecting Daniel to have a conversation with her about it. And the phrase about signing papers suggested something more specific than a simple discussion about future plans. Margaret had worked at the local library for nearly 25 years before retiring. And during that time, she had seen many people come in searching for information about property transfers, wills, and legal forms. She knew enough to recognize that documents involving a house rarely appeared without preparation. Ashley finished placing the dishes on the counter and wiped her hands with a paper towel. "We should probably head out soon," she said to Daniel with an easy smile. "It is getting late." Daniel nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it is about a 30-minute drive back home." Margaret turned toward them, her expression gentle and calm, the same warm look she had worn all evening. "Thank you both for coming tonight," she said softly. Daniel stepped forward and gave her a quick hug before reaching for his jacket. Ashley followed with a polite embrace and another compliment about dinner. A few minutes later, the front door closed behind them, and their car engine faded down the quiet street. Margaret remained in the kitchen for a long moment after they left. The house felt quiet again, the same quiet she had grown used to over the past 5 years. But something inside her had changed. She now understood that the evening had not simply been a pleasant family dinner. It had been the beginning of a conversation that Daniel and Ashley were preparing to have. And Margaret Collins had just learned enough to realize that when that conversation finally arrived, it would not be as simple as they expected. The house felt noticeably quieter after Daniel and Ashley left, the kind of deep quiet that only arrived late in the evening when the street outside had settled and the last car headlights had disappeared around the corner. Margaret Collins turned off the kitchen light and slowly walked back into the dining room, her steps measured and calm. The dishes were clean, the table was clear, and the faint scent of roasted chicken still lingered in the air. She stood beside the oak table Robert had built more than 30 years earlier and rested her hand gently on its smooth surface. For a long moment she simply stood there, thinking. The messages she had seen earlier replayed clearly in her mind, each word carrying more meaning now that the evening was over. Someone outside the family expected Daniel to talk to her about the house. Someone believed there were papers she might be asked to sign. Margaret had always believed that important family conversations happened openly, with honesty and respect. Yet tonight she had seen enough to understand that something different might be unfolding. She walked slowly toward the living room and sat down in the same armchair where she often spent her evenings reading. The lamp beside her cast a warm circle of light across the coffee table, illuminating a few old photo albums stacked neatly in the corner. Margaret reached for the top album without really thinking and opened it carefully. Inside were photographs from many years ago. There was Daniel at 7 years old holding a baseball glove that looked almost too large for his small hands. There was Robert standing beside the unfinished frame of the house, while construction tools lay scattered around the yard. Margaret studied the picture quietly. Robert had been proud of building this home with his own hands. He used to say that a house was not just wood and brick. It was the place where a family built its future together. Margaret closed the album slowly and leaned back in the chair. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to think clearly about what the messages might truly mean. Daniel and Ashley had not mentioned anything about documents during dinner. They had spoken about work, travel, and ordinary weekend plans. That meant one of two things. Either the conversation they were planning had not happened yet, or they were waiting for the right moment to bring it up. Margaret understood something important then. If Daniel intended to ask her about the house, he would probably present the idea as something helpful, something practical for the future. Perhaps he would suggest managing the property together or simplifying responsibilities as she grew older. The words might sound reasonable on the surface. Margaret had seen many situations like that during her years working at the library, where elderly homeowners were encouraged to sign documents they did not fully understand because someone else insisted it would make life easier. Margaret was not angry as these thoughts formed. She felt something steadier than anger. She felt prepared. Living nearly 7 decades had given her plenty of time to learn how people behaved when they believed they were being careful. They often underestimated the person sitting quietly across from them. Margaret looked around the familiar room once more, her gaze resting on the photographs, the wooden shelves, and the small clock ticking steadily above the doorway. This house held more than financial value. It held the history of her life. And if Daniel and Ashley were planning a conversation about it, Margaret Collins now understood that she needed to listen very carefully when that moment arrived, because the future of this home might depend on what she chose to say next. The following morning arrived with a pale gray sky stretching over Columbus, Ohio, and Margaret Collins woke earlier than usual. Sunlight had not yet reached the front windows when she stepped quietly into the kitchen and began preparing coffee. The familiar routine felt comforting. The soft hum of the coffee maker, the faint ticking of the wall clock, and the cool air drifting through the small window above the sink all reminded her that life often continued calmly even when important thoughts were forming beneath the surface. Margaret carried her cup to the dining table and sat in the same chair where Daniel had been sitting the night before. From this angle, she could see the entire room clearly, the framed photographs, the polished oak table, and the narrow hallway that led toward the front door. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Yet Margaret herself felt different. She had spent much of the night thinking carefully about the messages she had seen on Ashley's phone. Each time she reviewed the words in her mind, the meaning seemed clearer. Someone expected Daniel to ask her to sign something related to the house. Someone believed that if those papers were signed, the situation would become easier later. Margaret had lived in this home long enough to understand its value, both emotionally and financially. Over the years, houses in the neighborhood had gradually increased in price. The modest property Robert built decades earlier was now worth several $100,000. She knew that much because neighbors occasionally mentioned the rising prices whenever a home down the street was sold. Margaret took a slow sip of coffee and looked toward the window where the early morning light had begun to brighten the yard. She did not feel frightened by what she had discovered. Instead, she felt alert, the way a person might feel when they suddenly realized an important conversation was approaching. Daniel had not said anything about documents during dinner, which meant he was either waiting for the right time or he believed the subject might be uncomfortable to introduce. Margaret understood that possibility. People often delayed difficult discussions until they believed the moment felt natural. But Margaret also knew something. Daniel and Ashley did not realize. She already had information they assumed she did not know. That difference changed everything. She stood up from the table and walked toward the small desk in the corner of the living room. Inside one of the drawers, she kept a neat folder containing important household records, including the deed to the house and a few other legal papers Robert had organized years ago. Margaret opened the drawer and looked at the folder for a moment without touching it. Robert had always believed in keeping documents clear and secure. He used to say that written agreements mattered because they shaped the future long after a conversation ended. Margaret closed the drawer again gently and returned to the kitchen. The coffee had grown slightly cooler, but she finished it slowly while looking around the room she had cared for most of her adult life. She knew Daniel would likely call or visit again soon. Perhaps he would mention something about making things easier for her as she grew older. Perhaps he would present an idea that sounded helpful at first. Margaret Collins felt calm as she considered these possibilities. The messages she had seen were no longer confusing. They were simply information. And information, Margaret understood very well, could become a powerful advantage for the person who chose to listen carefully and think before responding. 2 days later, the phone call Margaret had quietly expected finally arrived. It was late in the afternoon, just after 4 o'clock, when the sunlight stretched across the living room floor in long golden lines. Margaret was sitting in her usual chair reading a small gardening magazine when the phone on the side table began to ring. She already had a feeling about who it would be before she even reached for it. "Hello, Mom," Daniel's voice said on the other end of the line, warm and familiar. Margaret smiled gently even though he could not see it. "Hello, Daniel. How are you today?" Daniel paused briefly, the way people often do when they are deciding how to begin a conversation. "Ashley and I were thinking about stopping by this evening," he said. "We wanted to talk with you about something important." Margaret leaned back in her chair and looked across the room toward the dining table Robert had built so many years earlier. The house was quiet again, but the quiet no longer felt uncertain. "Of course," she answered calmly. "You are always welcome here." About an hour later, Daniel's car pulled into the driveway. Margaret watched through the living room window as he stepped out of the driver's seat, while Ashley gathered a small folder from the passenger side. That detail did not escape Margaret's attention. When they walked inside, Daniel greeted her with a quick hug while Ashley placed the folder neatly on the dining table. The three of them sat down together, the same way they had during dinner a few nights earlier. Daniel cleared his throat softly. "Mom, we wanted to talk about something that could make things easier for you in the future," he began. Ashley nodded supportively beside him. Margaret listened without interrupting. Daniel explained that as people grew older, managing property could become complicated. He said that he and Ashley had spoken with a friend who understood paperwork related to homes and finances. Ashley gently opened the folder and slid several documents across the table. "These are just forms that allow Daniel to help manage things if you ever need it," she said kindly. "It is really just a precaution." Margaret looked down at the papers without touching them yet. The conversation sounded almost exactly the way she had imagined it would. The words were polite, careful, and wrapped in the language of concern. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You do not have to worry about anything," he added. "This would just make things simpler down the road." Margaret finally lifted the top sheet and scanned the text slowly. Years of reading documents at the library had made her comfortable with legal language. She noticed several phrases immediately that described transferring authority related to the property. After a quiet moment, she placed the paper back on the table and looked at Daniel and Ashley with a calm expression. "You both seem to have thought a great deal about this," she said gently. Daniel nodded. "We just want to help." Margaret folded her hands together on the table. "That is kind of you," she replied softly. Then she paused for a moment before continuing. "But before I sign anything related to this house, I believe it would be wise for me to speak with my own attorney first." The room grew very still for a brief second. Daniel blinked in mild surprise, while Ashley's polite smile tightened slightly at the edges. Margaret's voice remained warm and steady as she added one final sentence. "After all, this house has been part of my life for more than 30 years. I think it deserves careful decisions." In that quiet moment, Margaret Collins realized something important. The messages she had seen earlier had given her exactly what she needed. Not anger, not confrontation, but clarity.